I mentioned in the sermon, or at least alluded to it, that not everybody is convinced that Paul wrote the words of Romans 13, 1 through 7. And this has been a debate for many years. There's reasons for that debate, but really the idea is that the verses beginning in verse 8 flow pretty well from what was the end of what we call Romans chapter 12. And so some think that the information in verses 1 through 7 of chapter 13 was added later by someone. But most scholars today disagree with that assessment, and although I don't consider myself near in that world of that scholarly type, I also agree that Paul wrote this. And what I want to do today and tomorrow is I want to share 3 reasons why I do believe that this text fits well within this section, that it's not something that was added later, that it was not something that somebody else instigated, but that Paul had a reason to do so, and therefore he did. So today I'm going to share 2 reasons, and then tomorrow I will share a 3rd. The first reason I want to share is literary. It's not the most important reason, but again, as I just mentioned, a lot of people say, well, you know, if you go from the end of Romans chapter 12, verse 21, and you just start with Romans 13, 8, it flows pretty naturally. We don't have to worry about it. We take these other verses out, we're not really missing anything. Well, let's remember first off that the chapters and verses were added many centuries later. They weren't a part of Paul. Just like if you and I were to write a note or to write a letter, we don't go through and say, well, paragraph 1, sentence 2, or in the middle of a sentence, break it off with another number. So we don't do that. Neither did Paul. These things were added for our benefit at a later point so that if somebody said, hey, open your Bible to this, people weren't just fiddling around for 3 hours trying to find a word. We have a nice indexed system. Here's the name of the letter. Here is the chapter that it goes to. Here is a verse within a particular chapter. So, again, Paul wrote the way we would have written. But the words that we find in this passage that we refer to as Romans 13, 1 through 7 do fit the context. In the previous verses, Paul began with transforming our mind, going back to 12, 1 and 2, with transforming our mind to serve one another and to serve within the church, and then about verse 9, loving those within the church. Then in the latter part of Romans 12, the focus the focus was on how to live and interact with those who are apart from the church. Well, much of the government in Rome was apart from the church. So, as such, Paul wanted his readers to know that his words meant not only friends and neighbors, but this idea of love, this idea of having a transformed mind, which I'll talk more about on Wednesday, and tomorrow Wednesday, they also relate to government officials as well. Furthermore, if we look at the end of this section, verse 7, Paul writes about not owing any government official anything, whether it's taxes, whether it's tributes, whether it's respect, whether it's honor. Don't owe any of these officials anything. Then in the very next paragraph, which is going to be our text for next week, he begins by saying, don't owe anyone anything except to love each other. So this idea of owing carries forward from Romans chapter 13:7 into Romans 13:8 very, very well. I don't think that's coincidental. I think that is Paul writing on behalf of God. So again, that's the literary reason. I don't think it's the most important, but it needs to be said. The other reason for today that I think is important for us to really know that Paul did include this in his original letter is historical. Under the previous emperor, whose name was Claudius, the Jews had been kicked out of Rome. That happened in 49 AD. Paul was writing this, we don't know exactly, but somewhere around 55 to 58 AD. Many people put that more to 57, 58. That's where I lean. But under Nero, who came into power around 54 AD or so, the Jews were allowed to return, but the citizens of Rome at the time of Paul's writing were now growing restless over the idea of how much taxes they had to pay. Now, Nero actually considered doing away with one part of the taxes because of the uproar that was happening, not only in Rome, but throughout the Roman Empire, including in Israel, including in Jerusalem, which just about 8 years later would lead to a massive rebellion in which the people of Israel were squashed and the temple was destroyed in 70 AD. So, as Paul is writing this, the Senate, by the way, talked Nero out of doing away with that taxes. So as Paul is writing this letter, within 1 decade of the Jews being expelled from Rome, within a decade the other way from this massive tension having arisen, but it's been building over time, the overall tension was very, very high. And if the church joined in not paying taxes, notice Paul talks about paying taxes twice in this part, verse 6, and then in verse 7. If they had joined, if the church had joined, then the Jews and Christians would have lost a witness, and because of the Jewish situation just less than a decade before, having already been expelled, who knows what punishment would have come down on them. What Paul is saying here, it's not worth a little bit of money for the problems that you're going to cause and the witness that you are going to lose. So, again, within 10 years, many things would change. Nero would go mad. He would blame Christians for starting a fire that burned much of Rome, even though Nero himself is the one who likely started that fire. Christians began to be slaughtered by Romans. The people in Jerusalem, the temple was destroyed. So we know that many things happened over the next 10 years that were very, very negative, and they were the result of the government coming down on people of faith. And so what Paul is saying here, very similarly to what he says in 1 Timothy 2, to pray for our leaders and to live quiet and peaceful lives so that we don't stir up the government against us. There's no reason to stir up the government if the government is there. It's like leave a sleeping dog to lie. Let a bear stay in hibernation. Don't go nudge the bear unless you want trouble. So I do believe that Paul had reasons to keep the church protected, even if only for a time. And that's why not only was that statement to Timothy that was written later about prayer, that's why this message about paying taxes and honoring those who deserve honor are important. It was a part of the portion of this letter to this group of people, the church in Rome, to protect them, to protect their witness, so that they might have an opportunity to show unity together, Jew and Gentile together as Christians, and make an impact for the world that they otherwise would not have if they were at odds, not only with the government, but the odds that would drive themselves apart as well.